This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of history and Asian studies at Pennsylvania State University. He's also the author of a new book entitled Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture, that was recently published in English by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Ran Zwigenberg, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, happy to be here.
So, in January 1963, on the 18th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a group of Japanese peace activists organized what became known as the Hiroshima-Auschwitz Peace March at the site of the infamous Nazi death camp, with a stated goal of uniting the victims and places of tragedy of the Second World War. Now, that little-known episode is in fact the exception that confirms the rule, because the commemoration of the two greatest tragedies of the 20th century that were, in addition, almost simultaneous, has always been done separately, or in most cases. Why is that?
Well, they're very, very different events, first of all, and they're done in very different, geographically different places, but they were actually, from the start, they were connected to each other intellectually or symbolically, because they're both in the 40s and the 50s seen as connected to each other as the worst that men can do to men, and as a sort of a symbol of the crisis of modernity, the crisis of our civilization, because both were horrors that are done with people with PhDs. Mm-hmm. They were done in a way by science. If you think about, it wasn't even called the Holocaust then, but the Holocaust at the time was Auschwitz. It was not a killing field. It was not people shooting innocent women and children in the head, but people thought about the gas chambers, about a factory of death. Mm-hmm. And if you think about this imagery, it's actually much easier to connect it with Auschwitz. So symbolically, it was connected and used together quite a lot in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, okay, so that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, it should have been done a lot more often than it has been. Historically,
it has been done, but again, if you look at it from, depends on what point of view. If you look at it from American point of view, or European or German point of view, or Israeli point of view, the narratives, the way people talk about it was very different, of course. And what this peace delegation, looking at this delegation allowed me to do is, because they actually traveled for the different places, and how those two events were understood very differently in different places, and they had very different lessons in very different places.
So where did this come from, this initiative of Hiroshima, Auschwitz, Peace March, of commemorating both together? If I'm not entirely sure what you think about it, whether there is more crossover than what separates the two, or vice versa.
Well, there's a lot of miscommunication. A lot of what my book is about, what globalization means, in a very abstract level, it's about how ideas spread, and how ideas, but special kind of ideas about mass death and tragedy on a colossal scale, right? I mean, the Jewish people had to deal with the Holocaust, and the people of Hiroshima, I wouldn't say the Japanese as a whole, but people of Hiroshima had to deal with something pretty similar. So, of course, the events are very, very different, but the reactions are actually quite similar on a very personal level.
But also, I would say that at least in terms of commemoration, the message, the universal message of never again, is what really unites the two, right?
Yeah, but this is how I think the idea works. So you have the thing of format, the format and of never again. The forms of commemoration, building a memorial, having a museum, having survivor giving witness, teaching the children. The format is actually very similar. Mm-hmm. The content is completely opposite. And this is what those marchers realized when they got to Israel in 1962.
What do you mean, the content?
Well, in Hiroshima, because of very peculiar historical circumstances, Hiroshima was under American occupation. And the Americans would not allow any kind of story of vengeance, the kind of story that we told ourselves.
We as Jews?
Israel, as Jews, with the basic No one in Israel said, let's forgive and forget. Mm-hmm. Most people didn't. The ethos in the Yishuv, in Israel itself, and the Jewish people as a whole, was the one of vengeance. And the lesson is that if we want it to never happen again, we have to be strong militarily. Mm-hmm. This was the main lesson. Of course, there were many other reactions and various understanding of that, but that was the main reason.
Also in other places in the West? I mean, do you think that the part of the West's support for Israel, its sovereignty, its military might, is based on this?
A lot of it, yes. It depends when, because the West did not quite support us, right? Even America didn't quite support us the same way it does today. And the way that the Holocaust is seen is very different after the mid-60s, and this is exactly the time when America started to support us more militarily, and it does have some kind of connection, I think. But Jews in America, for example, had a very different lesson up to the mid-60s. Which is support civil rights. Jews
exactly. So it's more closely related to the legacy of Hiroshima.
In a way, yes. Because Hiroshima is not about civil rights, it's about peace and about humanity coming together, supposedly. And it's, of course, very problematic because the Japanese also did a lot of horrible things. So the question if they have a right to come in the name of humanity. And
maybe that's the thing that really separates them, that at the end of the day, Hiroshima was some sort of retaliation, very disproportionate, very brutal, but retaliation against Japanese offensive at the end of the day, whereas the Holocaust was really unwarranted.
No, of course. It was completely, as events, they were very, very different.
But still, I'm trying to understand why this message that could be, at least on the surface, merged together as the terrible, as you said in the beginning, the terrible things that man can do to other men, and this calling, this mission of never again, of let's look at ourselves and try to be better people for the future. Why isn't there more convergence between the two?
It's all about historical, what we in the trade call historical specificity. You have to think about the time. In the 50s and the 60s, outside of Israel, this idea that we have to be strong militarily and that never again mean that Holocaust, quote-unquote, belonged to the Jewish people, it's a unique event of the Jewish people, was not widespread. It wasn't even the Holocaust. It didn't even have the name. The Holocaust was understood more as a lesson about totalitarianism, about what happened with dictatorship, and a lesson about democracy, and it could have been much better connected to the message of Hiroshima. Also, the main problem that the world dealt with in the 40s, 50s, and up to the 60s was nuclear war. Mm-hmm. So what people were concerned with was nuclear war. And for them, the next Auschwitz would in a way be in Hiroshima. The next wave of genocide would come from the use of nuclear weapons. And the moment when those people come, again, very specific moment, 1962, it's both the time of the Eichmann trial in Israel, which made the Holocaust famous internationally, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's around the same time.
Yeah.
There was also Berlin crisis, a lot of crises when the world really faced nuclear war.
It's the height of the Cold War.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in this moment, nuclear issues and the Holocaust merge. And this seen from Japan, it made a lot of sense.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you about the Japanese perspective. So what really prompted those people? And by the way, if you can tell us about who they were and what exactly led them to start this initiative and try to associate Hiroshima with Auschwitz.
Yeah, they were a pretty interesting bunch. Like the lead person, a person named Sato Gyotsu, who was a Buddhist monk, was actually a soldier in China, who was supposedly, I never managed to actually confirm it, supposedly also involved in atrocities. And he, after the war, came back to Japan and decided to become a monk in order to repent. Mm-hmm. Maybe repent is a bit Christian, but in order to repent.
Right.
But he decided to work for peace. And the sect that he worked in was actually pretty involved in peace activities. And he took part in a lot of peace conventions and the anti-nuclear movement. Through those peace activities, he made connection with a Polish priest who was sent to Japan as part of a Polish religious organization. He was actually a communist. It was controlled by a communist, the organization. But the Polish priest is the one, and this guy, Sato Gyotsu, were the people who first made this connection. Then they turned to other people, and I wouldn't get into the actual details, but basically they decided through the anti-nuclear movement to send this delegation to Auschwitz to make this connection of the victims. Specifically because of the historical moment, because they felt they have to do something to save the world from nuclear war. Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about it is that the delegation went to Auschwitz overland.
Yeah. Well, more or less. They didn't fly. They had to take ships, of course, but they went to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, actually. It's pretty interesting. And when Vietnam, they went to Singapore, where they had pretty interesting encounters. India, through land, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. Then they came here, and the end of 1962. Actually, when they were in Israel, the exact time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from there, they went to Greece and by land to Poland.
How was the reception in Israel?
Interesting. They meet with a lot of people. They meet with students in the Hebrew University. And the students actually giving them a lecture about how the IDF has to be strong and we have to protect ourselves. And there's just really this mismatch between...
Because they come with the exact opposite message.
The exact opposite. It's like, why don't you...
Disarm,
hold hands.
Yeah.
Well, basically, hold hands with the Arabs. They do actually meet also with Arab Israelis and have the same kind of misunderstanding as they had with... they meet with some communist... I forgot the name, but a communist party politician in Nazareth. And also have some problems. They meet with Holocaust survivors. They hear testimonies. But they don't stay for a long time. They actually leave earlier than they planned. And in their report, they drop Israel completely from the report. It's like they've never been here.
We talked earlier about the different way of, different lessons that were drawn from the Holocaust in Israel and in the West, namely by American Jews, but also others. Was there, or has there been a difference in the modes of commemoration of Hiroshima in Japan and among expat groups in the West, or maybe just Western societies?
Commemoration of Hiroshima?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in the West, it's much more connected to concrete political issues. Because in the idea in Japan, that particular, because of it came under an American occupation, it's pretty, I would even say, banal. They don't say who dropped the bomb. Right. Because, again, it evolved under American occupation, and now they want to be buddies with the Americans. It's more complicated, make it very simple. So when you get into the museum in Hiroshima, they say the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Very passive. Well, in Germany, for example, which is a very interesting case because the Germans are very keen on commemorating Hiroshima. If you've been to Berlin, you know there's a Hiroshima Straße. And there's also, before there is a Dresden Straße or something like that, there is a Hiroshima Straße. And a lot of Germans are very involved. And
it goes all the way to Hiroshima.
Yeah, well, I didn't try, but... Yeah. And the Germans are very, very involved in commemoration. They actually built a cathedral in Hiroshima as early as 1948. But the Germans are much more anti-American, much more politically radical than the Japanese.
How so?
If you think about it, people who ended up in Baader-Meinhof, the terrorist group, the Red Army, the German Red Army, they all started with the anti-nuclear movement. And they're much more, like the main German anti-nuclear movement was in the late 50s was the campaign for atomic death.
Is it because they blame the Americans for not drawing the right lessons from Hiroshima that instead of receding in the nuclear arms race, they are just doing the opposite?
The idea is, and again, it's very complicated because there's various groups, and I don't want to make uber generalizations here, but basically the German peace movement are saying, we learned our lessons. We learned that war is bad. You, British and Americans, keep dropping bombs on people, keep going to war, but we learned our lessons. So German peace movement and if you think about the Gulf War, both of them, the Iraq War, and every time the German peace movement is opposed to American foreign policy, there's this sense of moral superiority. Like that we kind of learned our lessons, that even though they're the one who blamed for the Holocaust, they, in a way, because they learned, it's a bit convoluted. They can now tell the British and Americans about the right way forward.
Let's now focus on Japan proper. How has the commemoration of Hiroshima developed over time? In the 50s and 60s, of course, it was against the backdrop of imminent nuclear war. And, of course, the memory was still fresh in the minds of many people. There were many survivors around. And as we progress, now it's more than 70 years after the event, survivors are dying out. Is it evolving in a way that is perhaps similar to the way that the commemoration of the Holocaust is evolving because of the evolution in the historical circumstances?
Yeah, well, it's very connected to the Holocaust. And a lot of my book is about those connections. It's either this concrete case of Hiroshima Auschwitz committee, or I have another chapter about psychiatry, about how the whole idea of trauma as a psychiatric concept connected both places, but also you see a lot of direct connection. People from Hiroshima were here visiting Yad Vashem. They are looking at the Holocaust museums in Berlin, Holocaust museums in DC and in America.
Is it a two-way street? Are there any Jews or perhaps people who are more involved with the Holocaust who go to Japan to learn the lessons of Hiroshima?
Peculiarly, a lot of the intellectuals who are involved in anti-nuclear movement are Jews, mostly American Jews, but also very famous Austrian Jew, Robert Jung, who was very important in the European anti-nuclear movement. It seems there is a connection, but I don't see anything coming here to... It comes maybe towards the anti-nuclear movement in the West, but as you probably know, there is not much of an anti-nuclear movement in Israel.
Yeah.
And in Israel, you don't have... It doesn't really go both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And as...
Is it because has the anti-nuclear campaign everywhere, but also in Japan, lost its edge because the Cold War ended and it's not really an imminent threat anymore? Well,
now you have Fukushima. But just to go back to your earlier question about how it changed, this is exactly how things changed. They lost their edge. So if you look at the trajectory of it, up to the mid-60s, it was very politically relevant. It became more and more radical. But then came the Vietnam War and other issues temporarily made the anti-nuclear movement lose focus. So you will have environmental issues. I mentioned in Vietnam War, you have environmental issues. In the 70s, they're becoming very important. But then in the beginning of the 80s, there's this huge, huge fear of nuclear war. 82, 83. Like you have 1 million people marching in Central Park in New York City against nuclear war. You have... we're probably aware of all the music, right? Like 99 Red Balloons and all this lovely stuff that was made in the 80s.
And is Hiroshima evoked?
And Hiroshima is getting into the news again.
Uh-huh.
But by this time, because it came out of focus, they kind of there's a turn into more of a religious kind of feeling to it. It becomes more ritualistic.
Mm-hmm.
So
then an actual political action plan.
Yeah, so the politics evolved. Actually, it's a counter-reaction to politics. The place becomes very political, and the survivor, it comes from both places, both from the left and center and right politicians who want to take the edge out of the radical left, and also from survivors they can't stand the politicization of the issue. So there is a movement towards treating the place itself of Hiroshima. I didn't mention Nagasaki so far, it's very different, but treating the place itself of Hiroshima and the issue as kind of almost a religious issue of a sacred ground, prayer for peace, very quiet, very respectful, but without any political...
Just one question, by the way.
Yeah.
Why is Hiroshima much more in the news than Nagasaki?
It's the first one.
Oh, it's because it's the first.
The first, and many more people died there, and it was much more symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, it might be silly, but I think it's because it's easier to get. Nagasaki is much farther away from Tokyo, and you, for a foreigner, this is where you go. And those things tend to perpetuate themselves, right?
Uh-huh. Right. Well, that's all very interesting, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. Dr. Ran Zwigenberg, a professor of history and Asian studies at Pennsylvania State University and author of the recently published Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.